Welcome to Issues in History Today. I am Dr. Travis Bruce, and I'm speaking today with Dr. George Diener about what history can tell us about epidemics in the past, the present, and the future. Welcome, Dr. Diener.
Thank you, Travis. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So why don't we just jump into this, and perhaps you can tell us what history does tell us about past epidemics.
Well, history can tell us a lot about patterns of interaction with infectious diseases that can prompt epidemics, and they really reveal a lot about how peoples and societies interact with these infectious agents in the natural world. Epidemics have a very long history, but it's not as long a history as we have with the human species. Epidemics come into human experience when we shift from a nomadic group of folks into a settled population, because epidemics are fast-moving infectious agents, and so you really need a certain size of population in order to sustain this chain of infection. So our hominid ancestors and our humans before they went through the agricultural revolution were folks who had a different lifestyle. And so it's that radical change in lifestyle that leads to epidemics of infectious disease. And so studying that pattern in somewhat of the deep past can be really useful as we look at epidemics throughout history unto the present day. And it also serves as a way of looking into the future of things that are potential threats to human life in a variety of contexts. So,
do we have any indications, or how do you study epidemics in a prehistoric setting?
It's really, this is kind of a golden age for historical research, because there are such powerful new tools in the sciences that we can know more about these elements in the past than we could have at any time previously. I mean, history is always somewhat limited to what type of things we can recover, and historians today, as you are certainly well aware of, utilize a variety of different tools from a variety of different disciplines. So anthropology can inform us, linguistics informs us about people in the past, archaeology is really useful, and so there's also genetics work, which reveals certain patterns in terms of what type of evolutionary trends these infectious agents have had. So we can, and scientists have recovered things like the DNA from Yersinia pestis, which was the causative agent of bubonic plague. Things like they've resurrected the genetic code from the Spanish flu virus from 1918. And so we know things about these viruses that, and bacteria and other agents that cause epidemics in much greater detail than we have at any time in the past. So one way we can get at these sort of prehistoric things is to look at the basic pattern of these infections. What do they need? How do they move? What type of environments do they transit well? And one of the things that you see with epidemic, the illnesses and ailments that become epidemics, is that they have to be human transmissible. If something is poorly transmitted, then it's not something that's going to spread readily. And so that transmissibility is something that leads to epidemic outbreaks. The other thing about it is that it has to be something that requires a certain size of population. And so we can say pretty clearly that you're not going to have an epidemic of measles until you have civilizations or groupings together in larger numbers, because it's such an infectious agent that it moves so rapidly through the population that the survivors are immune, so it wouldn't have a population to continue the chain of transmission. So knowing what we know about sort of the makeup of these infectious agents and knowing something about the way these societies are organized allows us to recover some of that prehistoric material and then apply that to the pattern that extends, I suppose, since we have written history, which is a much surer account, at least of the broad patterns of these infectious agents.
Right. And does it, I mean, this is from the world history textbooks and Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, but is it, I think I remember it being something also, these close contact between humans and animals that is also important or essential in the beginnings of those epidemics?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because these infectious, many, I don't want to say all, but many of the infectious agents that become epidemics, they have their origins in animals. When a human is infected with an animal disease, it's called a zoonosis. And so we are experiencing zoonoses all the time. Some stick in the population, and what happens is that they undergo a sort of mutation process that shapes them for human transmissibility. And we can think of a recent event of one that didn't stick very well, and that would be SARS. SARS apparently is a bat disease that was transited through an animal called a civet cat, which is like a raccoon-like animal, and then into the human population. And then in the human population, it spread from human to human. It was no longer just a zoonosis being transferred from one animal to a human population. It was human-to-human transmission, but it burned out. For a variety of reasons that are still not clear, this particular category of virus didn't stick in the human population. And so when it burned out, it's no longer a human disease. But it doesn't mean that in the future it won't be introduced and then become a human disease and stick. But it's just a very recent example of a virus that made the leap but didn't stick in the human population. And so it continues unto the present day. It's that close connection with animals in a variety of different environments that leads to this transit from an animal disease into a human disease.
All right. And do we, as a species, I guess, develop resistance to these? Is something like the cold used to be something that would cause epidemics before? And
well, interestingly, most of our experience with these infectious agents isn't long enough in the evolutionary sense to develop this sort of protection. And I'll say that with a few qualifications. There is an ailment that makes you resistant to falciparum malaria. Sickle cell anemia is when an individual has two copies of that genetic abnormality, it causes a dire infection. But if you have a single case, it makes you resistant to infection with falciparum malaria, which in regions where that is something that is endemic, that it's there all the time, that's a very useful protection. So there is genetic pressure for some select diseases, but for the most part, our evolutionary experience with it hasn't been long enough. So immunity is acquired through bitter experience, or since we have vaccines today, through fake bitter experience by exposing our children to similar organisms that provide this sort of protection. But in general, immunity is not inheritable. So you need that sort of evolutionary pressure for a long time to allow nature to select things. And it has to be particularly dire as well. It can't be a mild infection like the common cold is very mild. And so it wouldn't favor selective pressure to make somebody resistant to the common cold.
Okay. And so what is it that allows these diseases to become epidemics? So you mentioned connections at a certain population level. Do you have examples of?
Well, connections are really the key. When an organism enters into a population, and this is a very old process, William McNeill in his book, The Rise of the West, referred to it as the closing of the ecumen, where you had the interconnections of populations that were fairly dense and separated, but when they came into contact with one another, they began to exchange things. And one of the things they exchanged inadvertently was infectious diseases, so that it circulated through the entire population and became a disease of the entire population, which eventually became the disease population of Eurasia. And then because Africa was very closely connected in a variety of ways to Eurasia, it becomes Eurasian in Africa. So you have a population where these diseases are circulating, it becomes something endemic, and if it comes often enough, it's referred to as a childhood disease, where children are the only ones who lack the immunity to these infections. And so when they contract it, it's something that circulates in the population. But if you extend to a new population, this is a process which occurred, as McNeill refers to it, prior to us recording it. This must have been the process to make these diseases widespread from when they entered into a human population, and then the connections to other humans made it something that everyone was exposed to, that was in the connections. And so when you establish new connections, like sailing across the Atlantic Ocean and bumping into the Americas, you establish a connection which allows many things to traverse, including infectious diseases. So the experience of the dire experience of native peoples in the Americas and later in the Pacific islands are people who were immune or naive to these infections, and then they were exposed to them and suffered terrible consequences, as Alfred Crosby talks about in Columbian Exchange and Ecological Imperialism. So that process is one of connections. We can think of another one, the connections established through trade in the form of across the Eurasian landmass that allowed the transiting of bubonic plague. The arrival of bubonic plague, which was known as the Black Death, set off a series of chain reactions of first terrible death and infections, but then that type of impact, of historical impact, is that it also creates changes in societies. The response to these infections is something that societies do, and then you have the responses as it changes the culture and the lifeways. Now, you're a medievalist, so you know about what happens in medieval times, Mediterranean world and Europe, after the arrival of the Black Death in the decades and centuries that follow. So, is there something you can tell us a little bit about the cultural or social impacts of that?
Sure. No, that's definitely one of the things, as far as connections goes, that I explain to my students, is the Black Death is a perfect example of the connections that were being made, the intensity of connections that were happening at that time. You couldn't have the Black Death in Europe if you didn't have the Silk Road, for example. And so that's one of the interesting things about it. So as far as the repercussions of the Black Death in Europe, some of them are very interesting in the way that because of in some areas up to 70% of the population was wiped out, was the way that it threatened to upset the hierarchy within society, in which we see people who had been victims of, I guess, an overpopulation almost, and who had been working for lower wages, who were in a situation where there was scarcity of land, are now in a situation where they can almost dictate prices, and they try to dictate prices for their labor, or dictate prices for their wages. And there is this there's this 30-40 year period in which things are kind of up in the air, and obviously the social hierarchy reimposes itself. But in that time, we have a number of rebellions, we have a number of revolts, the Ciompi Revolt in Florence, or the English Peasants' Revolt, in which we see these peasants who were aware of the fact that market forces had changed because of the Black Death and tried to take advantage of them, and then those efforts were repressed. But I think that is one of the things where we see these large-scale changes within society that come about because of these epidemics. Do we see that kind of thing anywhere else? Do we see, I mean, I don't think there are other, except for maybe the case of smallpox in the Americas, where such a large part of the population is just wiped out.
Well, the Black Death is quite a dramatic event. And certainly set off a number of repercussions that followed. But epidemics in the past have had an impact in a variety of formats. Certainly the case in the Americas and in the Pacific world, the way that Europeans colonized those places and then transformed those places would not have occurred absent these epidemic diseases. And smallpox was one of the most prominent, but there were a host: measles, mumps, rubella, the whole gamut, or many of the things that we give to our children to protect them today, were diseases that developed in the Eurasian landmass that had enormous impact on these populations. So that sort of impact, it's hard to gauge in places where we don't have the same type of record keeping that we have in other places, for example, in the Black Death. But the transformations that are set in place they're just inconceivable without this impact of these epidemic diseases. And it's not just something that, I don't know, I suppose you would say more of a deep history past. In somewhat more recent times, in the 19th and 20th century, you see the impact of these infectious diseases as well. And in some ways, it's the same pattern. You see this relationship of connections, of trade, travel, or conquest, of people coming in contact with one another another and serving to facilitate the transfer of epidemic diseases. But in some ways, there's new patterns that are associated with it as well. And one of those keys is the speed of transportation, because transportation allows you to deliver people or things to new destinations. And the faster the transportation, the more likely you are to see novel diseases that hopscotch around very quickly. And in the 19th century, a real clear example of that is the disease cholera. Cholera is a waterborne disease that was primarily located in the Indus Valley, or the Ganges Valley. And so as it exited out of India, facilitated by British imperial interests, the British Empire shifting folks around, shifting folks around, they served to transmit this infection to new populations, and new populations that were living in a way that made a waterborne infection conducive for spread. And so the urban centers of the world in the 19th century were places where the public health services, particularly in terms of sewage removal and freshwater procurement, were simply awful. And so you have a waterborne infection that arrives into those populations and causes quite a bit of havoc. And interestingly, there's more fear of this imported arrival of cholera than kind of really is warranted by the demographic impact. Cholera killed a lot of people, but not nearly as many people as tuberculosis killed every year. And so, to some degree, that newness of the ailment is something that induces a certain level of fear. You certainly saw it in the Black Death. I imagine native peoples had quite a dread of the arrival of Europeans, or even the word that Europeans were coming when they bring these infectious agents. And so in the 19th century, that sort of delivery of new stuff invoked quite a bit of fear and response, and the traditional responses of infectious agents are that some outsider is threatening you. And so in the 20th century, we see to some degree similar processes. The speed of transportation in the 19th century, it's railroads and steamships. In the 20th century, you have the arrival of the airplane. And so the arrival of the airplane, a new technology, a faster transportation method, serves to transmit diseases much more rapidly and in a different geographic pattern. It also, I think, induces quite a bit of fear in some populations that they feel much more closely connected to other places than they have in the past. And so somebody can get off a plane suffering some sort of infectious agent, and people who normally would not consider themselves under threat feel that kind of fear. And so it does induce societal responses even unto the present day. Perhaps not as dramatic as flagellants in the Black Death, but it does induce a sort of concrete reaction amongst peoples.
So what is your work, your own personal work on influenza, on the flu? Tell us about these epidemics in the past and how they function in the present.
Well, flu is really interesting, or influenza is really interesting because, well, one, it causes pandemics, if not on a regular basis, at least several times, and we know a lot more about influenza than we have in the past. And so you have a dramatic event like Spanish flu, which killed somewhere maybe as many as 50 million people globally. So it's a serious event. And then there are the fears of Spanish flu. And what also I find interesting about influenza is that it also enables you to investigate how states respond to it. And so some of my work has been about what is the response by governments and public health units to these type of epidemic events. And so that's what makes influenza really interesting, is that because they begin to know more about how influenza works and they're fearful of these pandemics of having dire effects on a population, nothing on the order of Black Death, but certainly something that's going to be disruptive to a society and to people, and it's going to kill people, which is, governments are charged with protecting their population. So you get these sort of programs that are designed to respond to them. And so I find that really interesting in terms of how public health programs are designed to deal with these epidemics. And they also reveal, the responses also reveal quite a bit about the governments and society at that time. So you see in the late 1960s and into the 1970s this sort of belief that modern science and medicine can serve to eradicate diseases. And so that that idea, which is born out of the development of antibiotics and the successful use of vaccinations, inculcates this sort of idea that, you know, diseases are on the way out. And then it doesn't work out that way. So the events related to the appearance of HIV and AIDS, the appearance of new infections, and then the reconceptualization of these infectious agents as newly emerging diseases is something that kind of reshapes the responses onto the present day. And so we're living now in this time when there's sort of a reevaluation of what how tricky, I suppose, the biological world can be in the form of epidemic diseases. And so the responses that work for influenza or were hoped to work for influenza, those programs really didn't work out as they anticipated. And then there's this idea that we have to be more vigilant. And so that is something that when we think about what do epidemics tell us about the future, well, there's things that we can kind of posit are going to be the responses to this. And some of it is the pattern. When you have large populations coming in contact with new areas or more intense contact, it's going to serve as an avenue for what was a previous animal disease to be introduced into the human population. And so an animal disease like simian, HIV, SIV makes the leap into the human population, and then through the changing world of the 20th century and early 21st century, it becomes a global pandemic. And then so you have SARS, which is apparently a bat disease, which because of a variety of changing things in Chinese culture makes it into the human population and then is spread around to Toronto, to Vietnam, to other places by aircraft. And so that sort of wedding of new technology with processes that are as old as human civilization leads to new epidemics that threaten populations. And so we can posit for the future that we're going to be continually facing these challenges of epidemic diseases. We can take a look at the world around us and see that there are changes that are going on in society that make it conducive for the spread. We have fast-moving and high-volume transportation. We have urban populations that are growing in size, in which not all these urban populations are well served by the fundamentals of public health. There's many places that have problems with producing or providing fresh water and removing sewage and garbage and things that provide dangerous situations. And because the world is much more interconnected through a variety of formats, we're susceptible here in Wichita or somebody susceptible in Kathmandu to something that previously would have seemed out of reach as a potential threat. And so it's always tricky for historians to make predictions for the future because we tend to be lousy predictors. But we can say that the world is very conducive to the spread of biological agents, some of which that can spread into epidemic diseases.
Excellent. Do you have any final thoughts for us to close on, considering epidemics or your own work? Or
well, I think it's really important to remember that more so than at any time, and it's always been true, but we are in a sense our brother's keeper. And we should be our brother's keeper out of basic humanity, but we're also our brother's keeper because the problems of our neighbors are our problems today. And so the more we can help people prepare for epidemics in their own locality, the more able we are to fend off these diseases before they become pandemics and impact a wider population.
And does that seem to be the basic policy that, for example, Western nations follow when it comes to epidemics, or? Well,
in the history, it's very interesting because this process of identifying our neighbors' problems as potential our own problems is of recent vintage. There was for a long time this idea of keeping things out. right? And so you have this quarantine notion where my neighbors are harboring some infectious agent, so don't invite them over for tea, or let them bring in their trade. But in the world today, that's simply impossible. It's impossible to quarantine anybody on any large scale. And so the realization that that is not a viable approach is one that has led itself to greater involvement in places with, even if it's just the selfish idea of protecting myself.
Right. Is that the kind of combined approach that we see, for example, with Ebola today, where there's this effort to, I guess, to some extent, quarantine, filter people coming through certain airports, but also try to, I guess, solve the problem by sending people to
Ebola is a new epidemic, relatively new. It first was discovered in 1976. And Ebola is an epidemic that's threatening populations in West Africa today and has spread to other places intermittently, mostly through people who contracted it in West Africa and then brought the virus with them. But it's really interesting because it does give us an insight into these two arguments. There's the argument that we should block off our borders and not let anybody in, but the discourse is being dominated by the scientific community who says, based upon the history of these things, that's not an effective model. What is an effective model is that we go help solve the problem in West Africa that is allowing the transmission of this infection, and that's how we protect our population.
All right. And do you feel, maybe this is to close things up, do you feel that people's almost paranoia when it comes to these infectious diseases and potential epidemics reflect larger paranoias and, I guess, worries in societies?
Well, I think epidemic diseases, they really illustrate this fear of the unknown, right? So Ebola is new and dangerous and awful, so people are afraid of it. And it's in some ways it's similar to 19th century world where there's a lot of fear of cholera as this import. But there's not as much fear about tuberculosis, which had been ravaging populations for centuries by that time. And so the focus on the novel as an element of fear is something that's very real and that we have to pay attention to.
Thank you, Dr. Deeney, for speaking with us today.
Thank you, Travis. It was a pleasure to be on the show.
And thank you for watching this second episode of Issues in History Today.